Hello everyone, another little revision video here. Today we're going to be looking at classification of joints. So just have a quick little think if you can remember what joints means. Hopefully you can. Little clue on the screen for you. Right, we'll jump into it. So what are joints? Hopefully you are thinking of the answer now. So definition, a joint is a place where two or more bones meet. So two or more, not just two, can be more than two. Joints that create movement are called freely movable or partly movable joints. So joints tend to allow movement in the body, not all of them, but most of them. And that's kind of the purpose of joints. So the first type of joint is a pivot joint. So hopefully you know what pivot means. It means moving around one spot, basically. You're pivoting from one spot. So the pivot joint in the neck, there's one in the neck, allows the neck to move from side to side, up and down, and rotate. So turn your neck to the left, then to the right. It's moving on a pivot. It's in one place, but you can move it side to side. You can move it up and down. And then you can rotate it so you can sort of bend your ear to your shoulder. The top two vertebrae in your cervical, in your spine, allow this, the atlas and axis vertebrae. You can also find the pivot joints in the wrist. So if you put your wrist in a fist and then push your wrist down towards the floor, then bring it back up, you can see how it's moving. And this is where the radius in your arm is meeting the ulna. And then, but the best example is in the neck. So have a go at moving your wrists and your neck, and it's also in your elbow as well. But the neck's the best example. Hinge joint. So imagine you can see the hinge on the right there. A hinge can just move in place, so forwards or backwards, basically, up or down. So elbow joint is a type of hinge joint, and it only allows backward and forward motion, and it's located in the humerus and the ulna. So the humerus is the long bone between your shoulder and elbow, and the ulna going down from your elbow towards your wrist. And it allows you to bend your arm like when you're doing a bicep curl, and straighten your arm when you bring the weight back down. And this is a hinge movement. You can get it in the knee as well, with the tibia and your femur to create the hinge motion. So when you're running, it uses a hinge motion because you're bending your legs. And in the ankle, it allows you to move your foot up and back down. So if you're doing hurdles, your leading leg will be dorsiflexion, so straightened toes pointing down. And in trampolining, you'll point up and then down in two. In the elbow, as well as the knee and the ankle. Ball and socket joints are exactly how they sound. So there's a rounded head of a long bone. So hopefully you can remember the long bones, the ones that are longer than they are wide. They don't have to be big bones. And they fit into a cup-shaped hole, which is known as a socket. So that's why it's called ball and socket, because the end of the long bone is a rounded head like a ball, and it fits into the socket. The shoulder joint is the perfect example of a ball and socket joint, as well as the hip. So you can see on the left, it says the humerus, so the top bone in your arm, and the end of the humerus has a rounded head, so that's the ball, and it's fitting into the shoulder blade, scapula, and near the clavicle into the socket. And then another example is in your hip, but the shoulder joint has a lot more movement, so you can move your shoulder round and round. Like if you're doing a tennis serve, you can bring your arm up and serve. And then the last one is the condyloid joint. It's a funny name, I know, and you can find this in the wrist. It's a little bit similar to the ball and socket, but rather than the bone at the end of the long bone resting against a socket or going into a socket, it rests against the end of another bone. So it's two bones meeting each other head on, basically, and this allows circular motion. So with your wrist, the best example I can think of right now is Harry Potter when he spins his wrist to cast a spell. Or if you're drawing a circle on a board, your wrist can go around in a circular motion. Or when we warm up, we sometimes roll our wrists and ankles. So found in the wrist, it allows all these things: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and circumduction. And then we're going to look at movement possibilities that we just talked about, like extension, etc. So flexion, hopefully you remember this, is a bending movement where the angle at the joint gets smaller. So where the joint is, the angle there gets smaller. So when you're doing a bicep curl, that's a good example, and you're bringing your wrist towards your shoulder, and then your ulnar and humerus are getting much closer together and reducing the angle, so the angle gets smaller. You can see the other examples: flexion of the knee in preparation of a kick, and in an elbow, like we just discussed, when you're throwing or doing a bicep curl. So that's flexion. And then the opposite is an extension. So if you'll bring the bicep curl down, the angle is getting bigger because the two joints are getting further apart. A good example with the arm is a tennis player reaching for the ball. If it's really far away and you're straightening your arm out, or in football, at the end of your kick as you followed through, your legs nice and straight to get the most power. Then we could look at abduction. Now you need to concentrate on these so you don't get it confused with adduction. Abduction means to take away. And if you think of the word abduction, to abduct someone is to take them away, to steal them basically, if something abducted. So remember that. Movement takes limbs away, so it abducts away from the midline of the body. The midline just means down the middle of your body, okay? Like it says there, if you kidnap, you have been abducted, taken away. So when you do a star jump, as your arms come out to a straight position and your arms are nice and high, that's abduction. Also, if you look at the top right photo of the gymnast on the Olympic rings, his arms are really far apart and nice and high, and there's been abduction at the shoulders there. And you can see the golfing example as well. Then the opposite is adduction, and if you take the first three letters, add, so you're coming towards the midline of the body. The arms are being added towards the middle of the body. So the second phase of the star jump, when you bring your arms back to touch your legs before you bring them out again, that's adduction, as they're coming closer towards the midline of the body. As the swimmer circles his arms over his head to enter the water, that's the butterfly stroke he's doing there. That also demonstrates adduction. Then we've got plantar flexion, which means extending or pointing the toes down or away from the shin. So where the shin is, further away from the shin as possible. So the gymnast here is doing the splits in midair. I'm not quite sure what this special jump is called. And their plantar flexion, their toes, as you can see, at their ankle. She's pointing her toes away from her body. Toes are pointing away from the body. And then the opposite is dorsiflexion. So you would bring your toes up closer to the shin. It's quite hard to do, to get them that close, but a ski jumper does it to keep their skis nice and high. They bring their toes towards them. And as a sprinter pushes forward out of the block, they're bringing their toes towards them as well, towards their shin. Then we have circumduction. It's a little bit confusing if you read that description. But imagine you're making a circle, but one end is remains fixed as one end is making the movement. So the distal end is making the movement, making a circle, while the proximal end remains fixed. So look at the cricketer in that photo. And then we have rotation, which is a movement where a bone or a whole limb pivots or moves around a single long axis. So it's a movement around a single axis or a pivot point. When a swimmer is swimming, they usually do 3 strokes, and then they breathe, but they rotate their head between each stroke. So when their left arm comes over, then as it comes through the water, they roll their head to the right, they rotate it to the right. Lots of you will have played table tennis at school. So when you try and do top spin to make the ball bounce high and into your partner away from the table, you rotate your wrist to bring the bat over the top of the ball, and that's rotation there. So you can have a look at the types of movements, which joints provide it, and examples in sport. So let's look at flexion. So they've given you, they've given you the first one. Then can you name the rest of the types of movement from their description? Can you then give them the joints that provide it and an example in sport? If you pause it now and have a go, and then once you've done, you can check your answers. So pause it now, have a go. Right, hopefully you've had a go. Let's have a look. So there's lots of examples here that we've already talked through. So you can have a pause and read through, check your answers. And once you've done that, you're all good and you've finished this little video. So well done.